October 15th, 2023. Babelsberg Studios, Berlin. Victor Kellerman had coordinated stunts for 3 decades without a single injury. That's exactly why the bullet finding its mark felt like déjà vu. The Glock discharged during take 17, a routine action sequence. Arnold took the hit in the shoulder, stumbled, then calmly asked for a bandage. 300 crew members watched a legend bleed. Victor's hands shook as he checked the weapon. The round was live, just like Vienna, 1974. For 49 years, Victor had convinced himself Hans Mueller's investigation was thorough, that his friend's death was equipment failure, that the Soviet faces in the background photos were just extras. But as Arnold's blood pooled on the concrete floor where another friend had died decades before, Victor finally understood the truth. Some accidents are 50 years in the making. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The medic's voice cut through the chaos. We need to get him to a hospital, now. Victor forced his trembling hands steady as he ejected the Glock's magazine. Empty brass casings scattered across the soundstage floor blanks that should have fired harmlessly into the air. All except one. The live round that had torn through Arnold's shoulder and shattered Victor's carefully constructed mythology about his own competence. "No hospital," Arnold said, his voice eerily calm as he pressed a blood-soaked towel to his wound. "It's a graze. Clean it here." The assembled crew grips, gaffers, script supervisors stood frozen in a semicircle around their wounded star. Victor had seen this exact tableau before, in a smaller studio in Vienna when the world was younger and the Cold War wasn't just a movie theme. Same shocked faces, same spreading crimson on concrete, same terrible certainty that someone had crossed the line between make-believe violence and the real thing. How does a live round get into a prop gun? The question came from Marcus Chen, the film's young director, his face pale beneath the harsh studio lights. Victor had asked the same question 49 years ago. The answer had cost him his best friend and a lifetime of sleep. Equipment failure, Victor heard himself say. The same lie Hans Mueller had fed him in 1974. It happens, but it didn't happen. Not to Victor Kellerman. Not in 30 years of Hollywood stunt work. He'd coordinated explosions for Michael Bay, car chases for Fast and Furious, and fight sequences that had put lesser coordinators in the hospital. His reputation was built on an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on paranoia. Every weapon was checked 3 times, every round was accounted for, every safety protocol was followed with Germanic precision. Arnold struggled to his feet, waving away the medic's protests. "We finish the scene tomorrow. Victor, you and I need to talk." The crew began to disperse, their whispered conversations already spinning the incident into Hollywood legend. Victor remained frozen beside the weapon that had betrayed him, studying the Glock as if it might reveal its secrets. The serial number was correct. The modification tags showed it had passed inspection that morning. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for the live ammunition that had no business existing on his set. A shadow fell across the concrete. Victor looked up to see a man he'd hoped never to encounter again, tall, silver-haired, wearing the same expression of calculated concern he'd perfected decades earlier in Austrian police headquarters. "Hello, Victor." Hans Mueller's English carried only a trace of his Vienna accent. Terrible accident, just like the old days. Victor's blood turned to ice water. "What are you doing here?" "Consulting on the film. Didn't Marcus mention they needed someone familiar with Cold War security protocols?" Hans gestured at the abandoned soundstage around them, its Soviet-era architecture lending an authentic grimness to their production. "When I heard you were coordinating stunts, I thought it would be a pleasant reunion." Nothing about Hans Mueller had ever been pleasant. In 1974, he'd been the investigating officer assigned to the shooting death of Victor's friend and mentor, Klaus Richter. The case had been closed within a week. Equipment failure, tragic accident, no charges filed. Victor had been young enough then to believe in coincidences and honest mistakes. Age had taught him better. "You're not listed in the production notes," Victor said. "Unofficial capacity. Marcus is concerned about authenticity. The studio wants their Cold War thriller to feel genuine." Hans picked up one of the spent brass casings, turning it over in his fingers. Remarkable how history repeats itself, isn't it? The same kind of accident, the same kind of weapon. Almost like someone is following a script. The implication hung in the air like cordite smoke. Victor had spent 3 decades convincing himself that Klaus's death was random tragedy, a prop gun that misfired, a blank cartridge that contained too much powder, a friend who was standing in the wrong place when physics turned deadly. But seeing Hans Müller here, in this place that looked so much like that Vienna soundstage, watching him handle evidence with the same casual authority he'd displayed in 1974, Victor felt the carefully constructed walls around his memories beginning to crack. Klaus was my friend, Victor said quietly. If there was more to his death, Klaus was a liability. Hans dropped the casing, the metallic clink echoing in the vast space, just as you became a liability, until you proved your discretion. 30 years of keeping secrets, Victor. 30 years of making movies instead of asking questions. But now you're old, and old men get sentimental. They start remembering things they should forget. Arnold's blood had dried to a dark stain on the concrete, a crimson accusation that someone had tried to kill him. Not someone random, someone with access to Victor's weapons, someone who knew exactly which prop gun to load with live ammunition, someone who understood that the legendary stunt coordinator would blame himself first and ask questions later, someone who had done this before. Victor watched Hans walk away, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous soundstage until they dissolved into the building's perpetual hum of ventilation and settling concrete. The spent brass casing lay where Hans had dropped it, catching fragments of overhead light like a malevolent star. The Babelsberg studios stretched around Victor like a monument to forgotten conflicts. Built by the Nazis, commandeered by the Soviets, and now rented to Hollywood productions that treated history as raw material for entertainment. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 3 decades fleeing his past only to find himself recreating it for audiences who consumed tragedy as spectacle. Victor's hands still trembled as he secured the Glock in his equipment case, following protocols that had become muscle memory. Check the chamber, remove the magazine, log the weapon. Simple procedures that should have prevented what happened to Arnold, just as they should have prevented what happened to Klaus all those years ago in Vienna. But Klaus hadn't died from a protocol failure. That much was becoming clear. The production photos from 1974 were still buried somewhere in his storage unit back in Los Angeles, sealed in boxes he hadn't opened since emigrating to America. He remembered Klaus laughing in those pictures, 25 years old with wild hair and revolutionary dreams, building elaborate stunts for low-budget films that challenged the Austrian government's comfortable relationship with its wartime past. Klaus had been convinced their work mattered, that cinema could expose truths politicians preferred buried. Victor had been less idealistic, more focused on the technical challenges of making violence look real without killing anyone. That practical mindset had saved his life and ended his innocence. The soundstage door opened, admitting a slice of gray Berlin daylight and Marcus Chen's anxious silhouette. At 32, Marcus represented everything Victor had once aspired to become, a director who combined artistic vision with commercial instinct, someone who could navigate Hollywood's treacherous politics while maintaining creative integrity. The irony was that Marcus had hired Victor specifically for his reputation as the industry's most reliable safety coordinator, the man who made impossible sequences look effortless while keeping everyone alive. "How's he doing?" Victor asked, though Arnold's preternatural calm had been more unsettling than any display of pain or anger would have been. "Stitched up and asking when we can resume shooting." Marcus approached cautiously, as if the concrete itself might be contaminated. "The studio's sending investigators tomorrow. Insurance requires it when talent gets injured." Victor nodded, already calculating how much truth he could afford to reveal. The live ammunition hadn't been an accident, but proving that would require explaining why someone wanted Arnold dead or wanted Victor to appear responsible for it. Either possibility led to questions he'd spent 30 years avoiding. "There's something else," Marcus continued. "I've been going through the production budget, trying to understand how Hans Müller got attached to this project. His consulting fee is buried in miscellaneous expenses, authorized by someone in Berlin I've never heard of. It's like he materialized from nowhere." Just as he had in 1974, Victor thought. Hans had appeared at the Vienna crime scene with credentials and authority that seemed authentic but left no lasting paper trail. Young Victor had been too shocked by Klaus's death to question the investigation's convenient conclusions. Older Victor understood that convenience usually carried a price. "You don't trust him," Marcus observed. "I knew him in Austria, a long time ago." Victor closed his equipment case, the latches clicking with military precision. "He was investigating the death of my mentor. The accident that made you leave Europe?" Victor had shared the sanitized version during pre-production interviews, a tragic mishap that convinced him to pursue safer work in Hollywood. The story had humanized him for American audiences who preferred their Austrian immigrants to be reformed and grateful, rather than haunted and suspicious. Something like that. Victor shouldered his gear bag, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility. "Marcus, I need you to understand something. If this production becomes dangerous, if people start getting hurt beyond what's explainable as accidents, you need to shut it down, immediately. You think someone's targeting the film? I think someone's targeting the past, and the past has a way of taking innocent people down with it." Marcus studied Victor's face, clearly weighing his director's instinct for drama against his producer's responsibility for budget and schedule. "The studio has $12 million invested in this project. Arnold's already talking about turning today's incident into publicity gold. The Terminator survives real gunfire, etc. They're not going to walk away from that kind of marketing opportunity." Victor had expected as much. Hollywood's appetite for authentic danger was matched only by its talent for transforming genuine tragedy into profitable mythology. Arnold's wound would become part of the film's legend, another example of the star's legendary toughness and the production's commitment to realism. But Victor knew the difference between mythology and murder, and Hans Muller's presence meant the game that had started in Vienna was finally reaching its endgame: inciting incident. The hotel room overlooked Potsdamer Platz, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing Berlin's skyline like a monument to reinvention. Victor stood in the darkness, watching late commuters navigate the plaza below, their movements reduced to anonymous patterns of light and shadow. The city had mastered the art of burying its past beneath glass and steel, transforming bombed-out wastelands into corporate districts that bore no trace of their violent origins. He envied that capacity for erasure. The manila envelope had been waiting on his bed when he returned from the studio, positioned with the kind of precise placement that suggested professional delivery rather than housekeeping oversight. No postmark, no return address, just his name written in handwriting he recognized with sickening clarity. Klaus's distinctive script, angular letters that leaned forward as if rushing toward their destination. Impossible, of course. Klaus had been dead for 49 years. Victor's hands had stopped trembling hours ago, replaced by the cold steadiness that always preceded terrible revelations. He'd learned not to trust his initial reactions to crisis. The body's first response was usually panic, but panic obscured details that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The envelope contained 3 items: a photograph, a letter, and a key. The photograph showed 2 young men standing beside a camera crane in what Victor recognized as the Vienna studio where Klaus had died. The image quality suggested it had been taken during their final production together, a low-budget thriller about Nazi war criminals hiding in post-war Austria. Klaus stood in the foreground, grinning with the reckless confidence of someone who believed truth and talent could overcome any obstacle. Victor appeared behind him, already showing the cautious expression that would define his later career. But it was the third figure that made Victor's blood freeze, standing partially obscured in the background, wearing the uniform of a studio security guard, was a face that belonged to Hans Müller, 49 years younger but unmistakably the same man who had investigated Klaus's death and reappeared today at Babelsberg. The letter was brief, written in Klaus's hasty scrawl. "Victor, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. The project we're working on isn't what it seems. The investors aren't Austrian. The script contains details about Operation Gladio that weren't public when it was written. Someone is using our film to expose NATO's stay-behind networks, and they don't care if we survive the revelation. I've hidden evidence in the usual place. Trust no one in authority. The Americans have assets everywhere, and they've been planning this longer than we've been alive. If anything happens to me, find this evidence. Klaus. The key was small and brass, designed for a safety deposit box at Kreditanstalt Bank in Vienna. Victor recognized it because Klaus had shown it to him years ago, joking about his insurance policy against a world that seemed determined to destroy young filmmakers who asked inconvenient questions. Victor moved to the window, his reflection ghost-like against the urban landscape. The timeline was beginning to make sense in ways that destroyed everything he'd believed about his own life. Klaus hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered to prevent him from exposing American intelligence operations in Austria. Hans Mueller hadn't been investigating the shooting. He'd been ensuring the cover-up proceeded smoothly. And Victor hadn't emigrated to Hollywood to pursue opportunities. He'd been allowed to escape because his silence was more valuable than his death. Until now. The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Arnold's shooting wasn't random violence or even an attempt on the actor's life. It was a message, delivered with surgical precision to ensure Victor understood the terms of engagement. Someone knew about the key, the safety deposit box, and whatever evidence Klaus had hidden there. They were recreating the Vienna incident step by step, forcing Victor to relive his trauma while demonstrating their continued power over his fate. The question was whether they intended him to survive this time. Victor's phone buzzed against the windowsill. A text from an unknown number. Kreditanstalt Bank closes at 5 p.m. weekdays. Vienna is a short flight from Berlin. Some secrets shouldn't stay buried forever. He deleted the message and turned away from the window. The careful equilibrium he'd maintained for 3 decades, the balance between remembrance and forgetting, between guilt and functionality, had finally collapsed. Hans Mueller's reappearance, Arnold's shooting, and now Klaus's impossible letter had shattered the protective mythology that surrounded his Hollywood career. There was no returning to the safety of ignorance. Whatever Klaus had discovered about Operation Gladio and American intelligence networks was apparently still dangerous enough to kill for. Victor's choice was simple: fly to Vienna and retrieve the evidence that had cost his friend his life, or wait for history to repeat itself with a different victim. The envelope's edges were sharp against his fingers as he considered the weight of buried truth. Klaus had trusted him with this responsibility 49 years ago. Perhaps it was time to honor that trust, regardless of the consequences. Vienna was indeed a short flight from Berlin. He needed to think practically. Cancel tomorrow's shoot. Tell Marcus the equipment required additional safety inspections. Buy time to understand what was happening before more people got hurt. Victor reached for his phone, then stopped. The device felt suddenly foreign in his hands, a potential conduit for surveillance he'd never considered before. Paranoia, he told himself. This is how conspiracies destroy rational thinking. But Hans Mueller's presence wasn't paranoia. The live ammunition in a checked weapon wasn't paranoia. And Klaus's letter contained details about their 1974 production that only someone with intimate knowledge could have written. Victor walked to the bathroom and ran cold water over his face, studying his reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. At 68, he looked like what he'd become: a successful Hollywood professional who'd traded European intensity for American pragmatism. The young man from those Vienna photographs had been idealistic enough to believe in dangerous projects and charismatic friends. That naivety had nearly killed him. Now someone was betting it would finish the job. The hotel phone rang, its old-fashioned mechanical bell cutting through his thoughts like an alarm. Victor stared at the black receiver, counting rings. On the 7th he answered. "You found Klaus's gift." The voice was German-accented, elderly, unfamiliar. "Good. We weren't certain the timing would work. Who is this?" "Someone who knew your friend. Someone who's been waiting for the right moment to honor his memory." A pause, filled with the subtle static of international routing. Klaus was braver than either of us understood. The evidence he gathered could still change things. Victor's grip tightened on the receiver. Klaus is dead, yes, but his work isn't. The people who killed him are still active, still powerful. Hans Mueller was never a police investigator. He was American intelligence, assigned to manage European assets like your film production. Operation Gladio didn't end when the Cold War ended. It evolved. The words carried the weight of revelation Victor had spent 30 years avoiding. "What do you want?" Justice would be pleasant, but survival is more realistic. They know you have the key now. They'll move quickly to retrieve Klaus's evidence before you can access it. You have perhaps 12 hours before they decide killing you is simpler than managing you. Victor closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of impossible choices. Why should I trust you? Because I'm the only person who knew Klaus's real name. The line went dead, leaving Victor alone with the mechanical hum of international disconnect. He set the receiver down carefully, as if sudden movements might trigger hidden sensors, then returned to the window. Berlin's lights stretched to the horizon, a urban constellation that revealed nothing about the shadows moving beneath its surface. Klaus's real name. Victor had never questioned the identity of his young mentor, accepting Klaus Richter as naturally as he'd accepted everything else about their collaborative relationship. But the caller's words suggested layers of deception that stretched back to their first meeting, implications that made Victor's head spin. His reflection stared back from the window glass, a man caught between past and present, truth and mythology. The safe choice would be to burn Klaus's letter, throw away the key, and return to Los Angeles with a story about family emergencies. Let someone else deal with 49-year-old conspiracies and their contemporary consequences. But Arnold's blood was still under his fingernails, a crimson reminder that safety was an illusion. Whatever forces had killed Klaus were active again, using Victor's own expertise against him. The live ammunition hadn't been meant for Arnold. It had been a demonstration, proof that they could turn his weapons lethal whenever they chose. Victor opened his laptop and navigated to airline booking sites, his fingers moving with mechanical precision. Lufthansa had 3 flights daily to Vienna. He could be at Creditanstalt Bank by tomorrow afternoon, retrieve whatever Klaus had hidden, and finally understand why his friend had died. The booking confirmation appeared on screen, flight LH1004-22, departing Berlin 1:15 a.m., arriving Vienna 11:45 a.m. Victor stared at the details, knowing he was crossing a threshold that led away from everything he'd built in America. His Hollywood career, his reputation for safety, his carefully constructed distance from European violence, all of it would become collateral damage if he pursued this path. But Klaus's letter lay beside him like an accusation, and Hans Mueller's smile haunted his memory like a promise of unfinished business. Victor confirmed the booking and began to pack, moving with the economical precision of someone who'd learned that preparation was the only reliable defense against forces beyond his control. Some secrets, he was learning, refused to stay buried forever. The packing should have been simple. A day trip to retrieve documents from a safety deposit box, return to Berlin, finish the film, fly back to Los Angeles. But his hands shook as he placed his passport in the inner pocket, and the tremor wasn't from age. He was lying to himself again. The hotel phone rang at 2:17 a.m. Victor stared at the receiver, knowing that nothing good came from calls at this hour. On the 4th ring, he answered. "Don't go to Vienna." The voice was American this time, younger than the previous caller. "Professional. We can resolve this more efficiently. Who is this?" "Someone who's been cleaning up Klaus Richter's mess for longer than you've been making movies." He wasn't the idealistic filmmaker you thought you knew. He was gathering intelligence on NATO operations for East German handlers. Operation Gladio was just one target. Victor felt the floor shifting beneath his certainty. That's impossible. Klaus hated the communists. His father was Stasi. Klaus's entire identity was constructed to give him access to Western film productions that served as covers for American intelligence gathering. You weren't making movies, Victor. You were providing logistical support for espionage operations. The words hit like physical blows. Victor sank into the chair beside his suitcase, mind reeling through memories that suddenly carried different meanings. Klaus's intimate knowledge of locations and security procedures. His connections with financiers whose backgrounds never quite made sense. The way certain crew members appeared and disappeared without explanation. You're lying. The evidence Klaus gathered wasn't about American operations, it was about his own. East German intelligence wanted to expose Gladio networks, but they also wanted to protect their assets. Klaus was documenting both sides, playing a game that got him killed when his handlers decided he'd become a liability. Victor closed his eyes, seeing Klaus's face in those final moments. Not the expression of surprise he'd remembered, but something that might have been resignation, as if Klaus had been expecting the bullet that found him. What do you want? The key. Klaus's evidence could compromise operations that are still active on both sides. Good people will die if that information becomes public. Good people are already dying. Victor's voice carried 49 years of suppressed rage. Arnold nearly died yesterday because someone wanted to send me a message. How many others have you killed to keep Klaus's secrets buried? Arnold was never in danger. The bullet was precisely calculated to graze him without causing serious injury. It was a demonstration of capability, nothing more. The casual admission chilled Victor more than threats would have. These people could orchestrate violence with surgical precision, turning his own weapons expertise against him while maintaining plausible deniability. Arnold's wound hadn't been attempted murder, it had been performance art. Hans Müller, Victor said. He wasn't investigating Klaus's death, he was covering it up. Hans has been managing European assets for 50 years, he's very good at his job. But Klaus's evidence could expose networks that stretch from Berlin to Langley to Moscow. The Cold War ended, but the infrastructure remained. We've been using it to prevent real wars ever since. Victor laughed, a sound devoid of humor. You're telling me Klaus died for peace? Klaus died because he was going to destroy mechanisms that have kept Europe stable for decades. His idealism would have gotten millions killed. The explanation carried the seductive logic of realpolitik, the notion that individual lives were acceptable sacrifices for greater goods. Victor had heard similar justifications from directors who cut safety budgets to meet delivery schedules. The math always worked until someone you cared about ended up bleeding. I'm going to Vienna, Victor said. That would be extremely unwise. Probably. But I've been living with Klaus's death for 49 years. I need to know who he really was, even if it destroys who I thought he was. The line went silent for several seconds. When the voice returned, it carried a different tone, regret mixed with professional resignation. If you access that safety deposit box, you'll become a target for intelligence services on 3 continents. Klaus documented operations that officially never existed. The people who ran them are still alive, still powerful, still willing to kill to protect their secrets. Then they should have left me alone in Los Angeles. Victor hung up and removed the phone from its cradle, letting the dial tone fill the room like white noise. He finished packing with steady hands, including items that hadn't seen use since his Vienna days lock picks, a ceramic knife that wouldn't trigger metal detectors, and Klaus's letter wrapped in plastic to preserve the evidence. The boy who'd believed in truth and justice was finally going home. Some graves, Victor was learning, demanded to be reopened. The ceramic knife felt strange against Victor's palm as he wrapped it in clothing, its weight triggering muscle memory he'd spent decades suppressing. But as his fingers closed around the familiar grip, a fragment surfaced from Vienna, 1974. Klaus teaching him to conceal weapons for their research into authentic props. Feel how the ceramic doesn't register as threatening, Klaus had said, demonstrating the knife's balance. Perfect for getting close to targets who think they're safe. Victor's hands froze. The memory had always existed, but he'd contextualized it as preparation for film work. Klaus showing him how weapons functioned for authentic portrayals. Except Klaus had said targets, not characters. And the knife wasn't a prop. It was functional, sharp, designed to kill. The realization struck like vertigo. Victor sank onto the hotel bed, his suitcase forgotten, as 49 years of carefully constructed memories began collapsing. Klaus hadn't been teaching him about film authenticity. He'd been training him for operations. Other fragments surfaced, each one reframing everything he'd believed about their relationship. Klaus introducing him to investors who asked detailed questions about security protocols, location scouting trips that focused on escape routes rather than camera angles. The way Klaus had positioned him during that final shoot, not for optimal coverage of the scene, but with clear sightlines to the crew positions where the shot had originated. Klaus had known the bullet was coming, and he'd made sure Victor would witness it. Victor's reflection stared back from the dark window, but he was seeing Klaus's face in those final moments, not surprise or fear, but something that had always troubled him. Klaus had looked directly at Victor before the shot, his expression carrying a weight that didn't match someone about to die unexpectedly. It had been an apology. The hotel room felt suddenly claustrophobic. Victor moved to the window, his mind racing through implications that made him nauseous. If Klaus had been Stasi, if their entire collaboration had been constructed for intelligence gathering, then Victor's escape to America hadn't been random opportunity. It had been orchestrated. His entire Hollywood career might be an extension of some Cold War operation that never truly ended. But which side was running him? His phone buzzed with another text. "The Vienna flight is unnecessary. We have Klaus's evidence. Your cooperation is still required." Victor stared at the message, feeling the last threads of his constructed reality snapping. They were watching him in real time, monitoring his travel plans, demonstrating their omnipresence with casual precision. But something in the phrasing suggested desperation rather than total control. If they truly had Klaus's evidence, why prevent Victor from accessing it? Unless they were lying. Or unless Klaus had been smarter than anyone realized, hiding multiple caches of information that required Victor's specific knowledge to locate. Victor deleted the message and returned to his packing, but now every item carried new significance. The lockpicks Klaus had given him for research, the ceramic knife that bypassed security systems, the knowledge of weapons and surveillance Klaus had insisted was essential for authentic filmmaking. All of it preparation for something Victor had never fully understood. His reflection caught his attention again, but this time he saw past the surface. The careful posture, the practiced awareness of exits and sightlines, the instinctive assessment of potential threats. These weren't traits he'd developed in Hollywood. They were Vienna habits. Klaus's lessons integrated so thoroughly that Victor had forgotten they weren't natural. Klaus had been training him to be an operative. The question was whether Victor had been an unwitting student or a willing participant who'd chosen to forget. The amnesia of emigration, the convenient gaps in his memory of those final weeks in Vienna, perhaps they weren't trauma responses, but conscious choices to preserve his sanity. Victor opened Klaus's letter again, reading it with new understanding. The references to usual places and insurance policies weren't about safety deposit boxes. They were operational terminology, codes that Victor was apparently meant to understand. Klaus hadn't just hidden evidence. He'd embedded it in systems that required Victor's participation to access, which meant Klaus had always intended for Victor to survive, to eventually return, to complete whatever operation they'd been planning together. The shooting hadn't been Klaus's end, it had been Victor's beginning. The realization brought a moment of perfect clarity about Hans Muller's presence at Babelsberg. Muller hadn't come to investigate Arnold's shooting. He'd come to assess whether Victor was finally ready to activate whatever Klaus had set in motion. Arnold's wound hadn't been a demonstration of power. It had been a test, and Victor had apparently passed. His phone rang. Without checking the number, Victor answered. "Welcome back to the game, Victor." Hans Muller's voice carried satisfaction that chilled Victor's blood. "Klaus always said you were the most naturally gifted operative he'd trained. 49 years of unconscious preparation. Shall we discuss your actual mission?" Victor hung up, but Muller's arrogance echoed in his mind unconscious preparation. As if Victor's entire life had been shaped by someone else's design. As if even now he was following a script Klaus had written before his death. Perhaps he was. But scripts could be rewritten by actors who refused to play their assigned roles. But rage was clarifying. If they'd stolen his life, molded him without consent, then he'd damn well take control of whatever remained. He finished packing with mechanical precision, then sat at the hotel desk and opened his laptop. The Vienna flight confirmation glowed on screen, but now he understood it was more than travel. It was a declaration of war against people who'd treated him like a chess piece for 5 decades. His fingers moved across the keyboard, muscle memory guiding him through encryption protocols Klaus had taught him for securing research files. The knowledge had always been there, dormant beneath Hollywood success, waiting for activation. Victor created 3 separate email accounts, uploaded scanned copies of Klaus's letter to each, then scheduled delayed delivery to addresses he'd memorized without conscious effort: journalists, government officials, insurance policies of his own. The betrayal cut deeper than Klaus's death. That had been violence, comprehensible in its brutality. This was theft of identity, the slow poison of manipulation that made Victor question every choice he'd ever believed was his own. Had he really wanted to leave Austria? Had his attraction to Hollywood stunts been genuine passion or programmed response? Even his careful distance from serious relationships suddenly seemed suspicious. Was isolation another layer of operational security? At 3:47 a.m., Victor called the one person whose voice he needed to hear. Jesus, Victor, it's nearly 4 in the morning. Arnold's voice carried the hoarse exhaustion of prescription painkillers, but underneath lay alert concern. What's happening? You sound like hell. I need to tell you something about yesterday, about why someone shot you. Victor's voice cracked on the admission. It wasn't random, it was because of me. The silence stretched long enough that Victor wondered if Arnold had fallen asleep. Then I know. You know? I've known you for 15 years, Victor. I've watched you work, seen how you think about angles and trajectories and human behavior. That shot was too precise to be accidental, too calculated to be random. Someone was sending you a message using my blood. Arnold's voice hardened. What I don't know is why you're worth that kind of attention. Victor closed his eyes, feeling the last pretense of his constructed life dissolving. Because I was never just a stunt coordinator. Klaus, my friend who died in Vienna, he was training me for something I've spent 49 years trying to forget. The people who killed him want to finish what he started. And you're going to let them? The question carried no judgment, only the practical assessment of a man who'd built his career on confronting impossible odds. But it struck Victor like a physical blow because he realized Arnold was right. He was still following other people's scripts, still reacting instead of choosing. No, Victor said, the word carrying more certainty than he'd felt in decades. I'm going to Vienna to find out what Klaus really died for. And then I'm going to decide whether his mission was worth completing. Good. But Victor, be careful who you trust. People who've been manipulating you this long won't hesitate to sacrifice anyone to maintain control. Including me. The call ended, leaving Victor alone with the weight of friendship and responsibility. Arnold had nearly died because of Victor's buried past, but instead of rage or recrimination, he'd offered understanding and tactical advice. It was more loyalty than Victor deserved, which made the stakes impossibly higher. Victor showered and dressed in clothes that felt like armor-dark pants, jacket with concealed pockets, boots suitable for running or fighting. The Vienna version of himself emerging after decades of Hollywood camouflage. In the mirror, he looked like a man preparing for war, which wasn't far from truth. He left the hotel at dawn, taking 2 taxis and a subway route designed to reveal surveillance. No one followed, which meant either they weren't watching or they were good enough to remain invisible. Given the sophistication of yesterday's demonstration, Victor suspected the latter. The airport felt like neutral ground, but Victor knew that was illusion. Every security camera, every passenger, every airline employee could be part of the web that had surrounded him since 1974. The paranoia was probably excessive, but paranoia had kept him alive when Klaus's optimism had gotten him killed. At the gate, Victor checked his email one final time. The scheduled messages remained unsent digital insurance policies that would activate if he failed to cancel them within 48 hours. Klaus's secrets would survive even if Victor didn't. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal in German, the language of his youth calling him home. Victor stood, feeling the weight of Klaus's key in his pocket and the ceramic knife against his ribs. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. Victor boarded the Vienna flight, feeling like he was descending into his own grave. The aircraft's interior lights cast everything in sickly yellow, and every passenger face seemed to carry potential threat. The ceramic knife pressed against his ribs with each breath Klaus's final gift. Weapon disguised as tool, disguised as memory. 3 hours later, Schwechat Airport materialized below through layers of cloud that looked like shrouds. Vienna spread beneath him in geometric precision, the city of his youth transformed into something alien yet familiar. 49 years had changed the skyline but not the underlying structure, the bones of empire still visible beneath modern flesh. Customs waved him through with bureaucratic indifference. No surveillance, no complications, which meant they were waiting for him elsewhere. Victor took the CAT train into the city center, watching reflection in windows for followers who never appeared. Professional invisibility, the kind that cost serious money. The Graben looked smaller than memory suggested, tourist crowds flowing around street musicians and vendors like water around stones. Victor walked through his past made manifest, recognizing doorways and cafe facades despite decades of modification. The muscle memory of navigation remained intact, Klaus's training embedded so deep it had survived conscious forgetting. Hotel Sacker still dominated the corner in imperial elegance, but Victor turned away from obvious luxury toward the narrow streets where Klaus had first found him. The address from the letter led to a building that had been gray stone in 1974 and remained gray stone now, immune to gentrification through sheer architectural stubbornness. The safety deposit box facility occupied the building's basement, accessed through a doorway that could have been medieval except for the electronic locks. Victor presented Klaus's key and the documentation that had somehow remained valid for nearly 5 decades, another indicator of institutional protection that chilled his blood. The clerk, a woman whose age was impossible to determine, led him through corridors lined with numbered doors. Box 247 sat at shoulder height, innocuous among hundreds of identical units. When the clerk's key joined Klaus's in the dual locks, Victor felt something fundamental shift in the universe's balance. Inside, photographs, documents, and a manila envelope thick with possibility. Victor carried everything to the private viewing room, his hands steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. The first photograph stopped his breathing entirely, Klaus shaking hands with a man Victor recognized from history books, a Stasi colonel who'd been instrumental in managing East German operations until the wall fell. But Klaus was wearing a suit Victor remembered from their last week together. The photograph was dated 3 days after Klaus's supposed death. Victor's vision tunneled, reality reconfiguring itself around this impossible evidence. The body he'd watched bleed out in front of him, the funeral he'd attended before fleeing to America, the grief that had shaped his entire adult life, all of it built on a lie so profound it made him question his own sanity. The documents confirmed what the photograph suggested. Klaus hadn't died in 1974, he'd been extracted, his death staged to protect an operation that had been decades in the making. The shooting Victor witnessed had been theater, complete with squibs and fake blood and his own unwitting participation as the essential witness. But Klaus was dead now. The medical records were thorough. Lung cancer, diagnosed in 2019, fought with the stubbornness that had defined his life. He died 3 months ago in a clinic outside Prague, finally succumbing to the cigarettes that had been his only visible weakness. The envelope contained a letter in Klaus's unmistakable handwriting. Victor, if you're reading this, then the mechanisms I set in motion have finally brought you home. The boy I knew in Vienna deserved better than the deception I built around him. But the man you became was worth the sacrifice of truth. Everything you've discovered is accurate. I staged my death to protect you from choices that would have destroyed your conscience. The network that recruited us both is real, still active, still believing that individual lives are acceptable currency for geopolitical stability. They're wrong. Arnold's shooting wasn't meant to kill him. It was meant to awaken you, to remind you of skills you've spent 49 years refusing to use. They need someone with your particular combination of technical expertise and emotional investment. Someone who can infiltrate systems they can't penetrate themselves. The operation they want you to complete involves preventing a terrorist attack that would destabilize the current European alliance. The irony is that they're planning to stage this attack themselves, then position their chosen candidates to discover the plot. Democracy manipulated through manufactured crisis. I've spent 20 years documenting their methods, gathering evidence that could expose the entire network. But I'm dying, and they know it. Soon they'll move to retrieve everything I've collected, unless someone stops them. The ceramic knife I taught you to use isn't for self-defense, Victor. It's for assassination. They expect you to eliminate 3 specific targets, all former operatives who've developed inconvenient consciences. Men like us who want to retire with dignity instead of dying for other people's ambitions. I'm asking you to save their lives by ending this cycle entirely. Everything you need is in this box. The choice, finally, is yours alone." Victor set the letter down with hands that betrayed nothing of the chaos in his mind. Klaus had orchestrated this reunion from beyond the grave, manipulating him one final time toward a decision that would define whatever remained of his life. Outside the viewing room, footsteps approached with military precision. Victor pocketed the photographs and documents, then palmed the ceramic knife with movements that felt like muscle memory awakening. The door opened to reveal Hans Muller flanked by two younger men whose suits couldn't quite conceal their weapons. "Klaus always said you were sentimental," Muller said, his voice carrying 49 years of patronizing authority. "Did you really think we'd allow you to access his evidence unsupervised?" Victor stood slowly, the knife's weight balanced perfectly in his palm. "Actually, Hans, I was counting on it." The first man moved toward him with professional confidence. Victor's response was instinctive, surgical, final Klaus's training expressing itself through movements that felt like coming home. When the violence ended, Victor stood alone among bodies that had stopped being threats. The knife felt natural in his hand, no longer a stranger's tool but an extension of his own will. Some weapons, once drawn, demanded to be used completely. Victor sat in the silence that follows violence, the ceramic knife still warm in his palm. 3 bodies lay around him in positions that suggested struggle but told the story of overwhelming skill meeting unprepared arrogance. Hans Muller's eyes stared at nothing. 49 years of manipulation ended by 6 inches of hardened clay, finding the precise gap between vertebrae that Klaus had taught Victor to locate in darkness. The viewing room smelled of copper and expensive cologne. Victor's hands remained steady as he cleaned the knife on Muller's silk tie, muscle memory completing tasks his conscious mind couldn't quite process. The boy from Vienna had finally caught up with the man from Hollywood, and the reunion was written in blood. Klaus's documents felt heavier now, weighted with the lives they'd cost and the lives they might save. Victor photographed every page with methodical precision, uploading copies to encrypted servers through protocols that felt like breathing. The evidence would survive even if he didn't insurance against the possibility that more handlers would emerge from whatever shadow network had spawned Muller. He pocketed the originals and walked past the bodies with the unhurried pace of a man whose conscience had finally achieved equilibrium. The basement facility's cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned 30 minutes earlier, Klaus's influence extending beyond death through allies Victor was only beginning to understand. Vienna's afternoon light felt different when he emerged, sharper and more honest than the filtered illumination of his Hollywood years. Victor walked the Graben with new eyes, seeing the city not as tourist destination or nostalgic memory, but as the place where his education in necessary violence had begun. Tourists flowed around him like water around stone, oblivious to the fact that 3 men had just died in the basement beneath their feet. At Café Central, Victor ordered coffee and strudel at the same table where Klaus had first explained the difference between murder and necessity. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd completed his education 49 years late, but with a thoroughness his mentor would have appreciated. The elderly waiter who served him moved with the deliberate care of a man who'd survived multiple regime changes by perfecting invisibility. Victor's phone contained 17 missed calls from Arnold, each message growing more concerned as hours passed without response. He typed a simple text, "It's finished. Coming home." The reply arrived within seconds. "Good. Sarah's making dinner Sunday. You're invited." The invitation carried more weight than Arnold could know. After decades of careful isolation, Victor was being offered something he'd forgotten existed, the possibility of chosen family, relationships built on honesty rather than operational necessity. The idea terrified and tempted him in equal measure. Klaus's letter had ended with a choice, but Victor understood now that the choice had been made years earlier when he'd accepted exile over examination, Hollywood success over Viennese truth. Today hadn't been decision but consequence, the inevitable conclusion of a story that began with Klaus bleeding real blood onto fake movie sets. The 3 men in the basement had represented more than institutional threat. They'd embodied Victor's own capacity for moral compromise. By killing them, he'd eliminated not just external enemies but internal possibilities. The version of himself that might have accepted recruitment, completed assignments, justified necessary evils for greater goods, that man had died alongside Muller. Victor finished his coffee and walked to Zentralfriedhof, Vienna's central cemetery, where Klaus supposedly rested beneath a headstone dated 1974. The grave was real enough, complete with flowers that someone had placed recently. But Victor knew now it was monument to performance rather than person, theater designed to provide closure to those who'd loved Klaus enough to mourn properly. He placed his own flowers, white roses that Klaus had always preferred, and spoke aloud to the empty grave. "I understand now why you left me behind, but I'm choosing different ending than the one you wrote." The words carried across manicured grass toward other graves, other lives reduced to names and dates that couldn't capture the complexity of human choice. The flight back to Berlin departed at sunset, Victor's window seat offering final views of the city that had shaped him twice, once as naive student, once as reluctant killer. Both versions of himself felt equally true and equally foreign, identities he'd worn rather than inhabited. But the man returning to Arnold's friendship and Sarah's dinner invitations was neither Klaus's protege nor Hollywood's success story. He was simply Victor Kellerman, 68 years old, carrying skills he hoped never to use again and memories that would define whatever peaceful years remained. The ceramic knife rested in checked luggage, cleaned and wrapped in tissue paper like the relic it had become. Some weapons, once blooded, demanded retirement rather than reuse. As Vienna disappeared beneath clouds and darkness, Victor felt the peculiar lightness that follows the completion of necessary tasks. Klaus's manipulation was finished, Muller's network disrupted, and the choice between violence and peace was finally, authentically his own. He chose peace, and meant it.